Shebani is a double board certified physician in obesity medicine and psychiatry. She's clinical faculty at Stanford University and founding director of the Stanford University Metabolic Psychiatry program, of which I am a proud advisory board member. And she's also the director of the Silicon Valley Metabolic Psychiatry, a new program in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Bay Area, focused on optimizing brain health by integrating low-carb nutrition, comprehensive psychiatric care, and treatment of obesity with associated metabolic diseases. Thank you very much, Shebani, for being with us. So can you tell us more about metabolic psychiatry and the link between brain health and metabolic disease?
Yeah, so metabolic psychiatry is a subfield, really, and it's really about describing the assessment and treatment of metabolic dysfunction and that as a means of improving mental health. So there's a crucial link, but a pretty complex relationship between metabolic dysfunction and food and mental health. So this idea of food as medicine is not a new concept, and the field of nutritional psychiatry has really grown over the past few decades by several prominent psychiatrists and researchers. However, there's been a focus that has been largely looking at specific foods or eliminating maybe certain things from the diet, looking at the microbiome, or looking at how diet affects depression symptoms. So these are all very important questions, but what metabolic psychiatry's focus is to distinguish that of how the treatment of the metabolic dysfunction can affect psychiatric symptoms. So a lot of, majority of the US population has insulin resistance or obesity. It's, 50%, over 50% now. So we're really looking at, well, what does this do to the brain? What does this do to brain health? We know that it affects different organs in the body, but we often overlook brain health. And so that's the focus of my study. It's interesting because mental illness rates over just the past 20 years have doubled, and we have very different phenotypes within mental illness. And we know that mental illness such as depression or bipolar illness and psychosis even are strongly associated with this increase in inflammation. So research is showing that there is an energy deficit in these brain illnesses, which I can talk more about, but that's a big link between, looking at metabolic health and mental health, and how these energy deficits are causing downstream brain signaling changes. And we see differences here in inflammation, like I mentioned, but also insulin resistance. And so we're looking at how to improve that.
So basically, you are saying that obesity and metabolic disease are associated with an excess of energy in terms of calories, but actually a deficit of nutrition. And this deficit of nutrition, of true nutrition, of nutrients, then is affecting brain pathways and the brain health, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, a lot of times we're thinking about this excess calorie relationship, but it's really not about that. It ends up that a lot of the folks end up being malnourished, very significantly malnourished, whether it's vitamins or minerals, or whether they have insulin resistance. Their brain, so to speak, is bathed in sugar. So our brain is surrounded by fluid, right? It's the CSF, and we have sugar that can enter, right? So glucose can enter. And so if you have more sugar around the brain, that affects the brain. And that's not a normal state. Insulin resistance is not a normal state of being. And so we see that that's, significantly associated with definitely a higher prevalence in this population.
And this is such a beautiful message, and especially for this course in which I'm making my students familiar with the concept that we think that having having our brain just feeding on glucose is the normal state, and we never allow us to switch from glucose to fat as a fuel by eating from time to time less carbohydrates or fasting, which has been a natural state during evolution. And now you are telling us that this has also some impact on the brain, because actually what is not physiological is having always this high level of blood sugar, and can be toxic to the brain too, right?
Yes, that's right. It's really interesting because when we think about what the brain is made of, right, there's myelin, which is surrounding the neural communication, right, and then we have neurotransmitters and proteins in between. But it's a lot of fat actually, and so this idea of fearing the fat has been detrimental, I think, for brain health. We need significant amounts of fat, adequate amounts of fat. And our brain does not work well. The speed of communication changes when we don't have the right nutrients and the right fat. So when you ask me about the relationship between mental health and metabolic disease, also, we know that it's bidirectional. That means that if you have a mental illness, you're more likely to have metabolic disease and vice versa. So isn't that really interesting that there is this relationship? There's something about this relationship that we don't yet completely understand, but we know there is one. So whether that is an increased brain inflammation that leads to downstream changes in the chemical messenger signaling, or some other process that leads to worsening symptoms, is really interesting. And the medications that we use to treat a lot of mental illnesses are life-saving for many, but they are associated with some undesirable side effects, some of them, and that can worsen metabolic health. So on one hand, we're helping with improving brain communication, but on the other domain, we might be intervening in some way, kind of the long-term aspect of improving symptoms if metabolic health is deteriorating. And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think it's a important field of research and clinical work.
Yeah. So once again, focusing, so having a reductionistic approach in medicine, like just treating one piece, looking at one piece of the puzzle and not at the system, perhaps it's not an effective approach, and can, in the long run, actually be counterproductive, right? I think this is another example. And I think, we have known that brain health, mental health is, it's about the relationship between genetic predispositions and environmental predispositions. But I think that people think more that these environmental expositions are exposures, life events, especially in the childhood, trauma, which of course is true, but also the environmental exposures are our dietary habits, nutrition. And I think this has been neglected for a long time. And in my course on diet and gene expression, I teach how all these exposures are important. And actually, I use the term epinutrients to describe all the nutrients that are in whole foods, and you can probably elaborate on that can affect our health through epigenetic mechanisms. And I think it's very likely that the deficit, the nutrition deficit you are talking about for mental health, is probably due to the lack of many of these epinutrients. So I'm curious to know more about that. So what nutrients are most commonly lacking or missing for people that have metabolic disease and then are more likely to develop brain health issues?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And to kind of make a comment on something you said earlier, is that psychiatric illness is very heterogeneous. So we know that diet and exercise can help with depression or other symptoms, cognition, things like that. That data is there, and that's from randomized clinical controlled trials. With looking at, we don't have like a single gene or a mutation or a lesion that we can point out for mental illness, because it's a complex relationship of multiple genes and environment. But if we can improve, if there's this relationship between metabolic disease and mental health, and if we can improve some part of that population, then we're really helping, because it's heterogeneous. If we can focus on some population that is going to improve because there's abnormalities metabolically, then that's a pretty big win for our field and for our patients. So with regard to specific nutrients, some vitamins like iron or vitamin B12 sometimes can be abnormal and seen as abnormal, when we screen. And there are other important nutrients. Most of the time, what I see most of the time is that there's insulin resistance or higher inflammation, and just reducing the amount of carbohydrates, the refined carbohydrates especially, as well as the ultra processed foods. When that is decreased, then even the absorption of other food becomes better. And so you won't necessarily have low deficiencies or vitamin deficiencies. So that's a really big piece. And most of the time I do a lot of teaching with that. Another vitamin I do see that's low quite often is vitamin D. And there were some recent meta-analysis that showed that a vitamin D level, above 45, which hasn't been the standard of what we try to achieve, has actually shown decrease in mortality and increase in mortality if it's lower. So that's quite interesting. And we know that vitamin D plays a role in immunity. It plays a role in, as well as, with infection and with memory and concentration and even mood. So it's very relevant for mental health.
Yes. And most of the guidelines, the recommendations are based on levels that should be met to avoid disease rather than to optimize health. So this is something to bear in mind. Yeah, this is fascinating. And so you talk about ultra processed food. Can you define that in more detail?
Yeah, so there's different categories of what we think of as processed foods, and ultra processed food is a category of foods where we're really looking at the kinds of things that are unhealthy, right? Those cookies are highly processed, or cakes or ice cream. Those are Coke. Those are things that we know inherently are unhealthy, and they're ultra processed. Now, there are other categories, like I was mentioning, of processed foods that, some amount can be processed, but I don't know that, we don't know that that's necessarily unhealthy as much as the ultra processed foods are. And we think that's the case because ultra processed foods raise glucose levels much higher and faster. And that is in some essence, what we worry about with insulin resistance, and also what we worry about when it comes to addiction. So there's this idea of food addiction, and this idea of, well, we're shifting the glucose so quickly, and that means that we're also shifting other hormones like insulin, and what does that do to the brain? And we know that that does directly and indirectly affects neurotransmitter levels, and it also affects dopamine reward pathways. And so that is a very interesting area of study as well that we're looking at when it comes to overeating and binge eating specifically.
Exactly. I think this is a very interesting point, because I think some food processing has actually been useful also during evolution, like cooking, for example, because it makes like nutrients more readily available, and actually was an important reason as to why we developed bigger brain and we thrived as human beings. But at the same time, food processing modifies the availability of nutrients and the speed of that so these nutrients become available to the brains and our organs. And this is there is a trade-off. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it can also affect us. Like I always think about the orange juice example, right? So a glass of orange juice, it's probably made of 3 or 4 oranges, depending on the size, and we can drink it in a couple of minutes. Would you be able to eat 3-4 oranges in a couple of minutes? And so this is clearly modifying our ability to get so much nutrients in a given time. And of course, I do use some processed food myself. Olive oil is a processed food. We because it's processed in a spoon of olive oil. I think there are 28 olives. So it is a kind of processed food, but this is as far as I get. And then
a good kind.
Yes, this is we all eat some processed food, but the ultra processed food, there is not a strict definition. I think some people say if there are more than 5 ingredients on a food, packaged food is an ultra processed food. There's not such a definition, but it's more or less is a good rule of thumb. Usually I only buy products that have 1 ingredient, because then I mix things by myself, so I'm on the safe side. But yeah, so so based on what you share with us, so lowering insulin resistance then can actually beneficially impact our brain health, right? And how a ketogenic diet may help within this context with the mental health and disorders like bipolar disease, for example, food addictions.
Yeah, that's a big topic. I'm happy to go through that. So just to comment on the ultra processed foods, those are usually packed with a lot more sugar and combined fat. So that's there. You're right. There isn't a strict definition on it, but there's a NOVA classification, and they have a NOVA 4 foods, and they consider the ultra processed foods having that high amounts of sugar and fat combined, which makes it addictive. So in terms of the ketogenic diet, I think we need to understand first, what are the deficiencies in some of the illnesses that we're studying. So with bipolar illness, there are deficiencies in, what we think we understand is that there are deficiencies in energy metabolism. So some of these mitochondrial dysfunction is a big part of that, as well as certain enzymes that are not working optimally. And when we think about neurotransmission as well, that's affected. And so oxidative stress and inflammation are other mechanism as to why we think that there's a deficiency. And so ketogenic diets can be a good intervention, we think, because it bypasses some of this energy metabolism deficits. And it does that because there are two pathways that it can take, right? So you're breaking down with the ketogenic diet, you're breaking it down into ketones, and you're breaking down fat, and you're shifting your metabolism from the carbohydrate burning state to a fat burning state. And so some of this ATP that's created, it bypasses certain parts of the Krebs cycle, and you're still producing ATP. So these cells in the brain that are using ketones now, they're bypassing what they would normally have been doing, where they are not making enough ATP. And so this is one mechanism as to how we think it helps. And the other thing is glycolysis, right? So that's another place where you can create glucose in a different fashion. And so oxidative stress is another reactive oxygen species is another mechanism as to why we think ketones can actually act that way as reactive oxygen species itself. And so if we have too much stress around the cell, that's what we call oxidative stress. And so what a ketogenic diet does is that it decreases that reactive oxygen species and inflammation.
Yeah, so just to sum up, basically what you are saying is that the ketones and fat burning in general is more energy efficient. It produces more energy per oxygen molecule oxidized, and less oxidative damage during the process per unit of energy. So basically, because we know that mental health is also oxidative stress is an underlying problem in mental health, you are addressing that component, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one mechanism that we think is helpful. But ketogenic diets have been studied for a long time, actually, and it's been well known for its success in pediatric epilepsy, with diabetes and obesity and insulin resistance as well more recently. But there's some improvements that have been shown in the neurodegenerative conditions and developmental disorders like Alzheimer's or autism. And so that was one way. But we also think that it does other things with changing the hormonal shifts, like I was mentioning before, so that it actually modifies that natural and drug reward pathway in the brain. So your hunger hormones are not going awry anymore, and it can actually change the reactivity of the dopamine system. And so when you are having excess carbohydrates, these foods will cause rapid shifts similar to what drugs of abuse do, the pharmacokinetics of drug abuse. And so you're also changing that system too with the ketogenic diet, at least that's what we think.
Yeah, no, this is very interesting, and it's something I still didn't discuss with my students, and I would like to ask you. So there are studies show that the ketogenic diet decreases the level of both ghrelin, which is our appetite hormone, and that increases appetite, and then leptin, which is actually known as the satiety hormone. And so you may think, okay, so this is a bad thing, because if my satiety hormone goes down, then I should be more hungry. But it seems that actually the ketogenic diet is enhancing our sensitivity, the way our body responds to leptin and other hormones, including the thyroid hormones. So there is a mechanism by which our body somehow becomes more efficient at responding to some hormones signaling, so that our body doesn't need to be so loud with hormones and bombarding lots of hormones in the bloodstream to have high leptin, high thyroid hormones, because our cells become more sensitive to respond to those to those signals. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think you made the point there that's most critical, is that it makes it more sensitive, right? So the sensitivity piece, where it's insulin sensitive or leptin sensitive, that changes when you're not having these excess carbohydrates that are essentially raising the insulin and changing the reactivity. It makes it more reactive, right? So I think ultimately, if you dampen down the response by having a more stable blood glucose, you also have a lower insulin level. You're making it more sensitive. The cells are more sensitive to the hormones. But beyond just that, it's also down-regulating our dopamine receptors. So the ultra-processed food and sugar down-regulates the dopamine receptors. So that makes us eat more compulsively. And so, that the highly processed foods will trigger the dopamine reward pathways and induce that addictive-like behavior where we have those intense cravings or feelings of withdrawal when cutting down on ultra-processed food, or continued consumption, right, despite knowing adverse consequences and so forth. So that's how we think about addiction.
And so dopamine, just for those who are not biology experts, is known as the feel-good hormone, right? Or that it's controlling the reward pathways, as Shebani mentioned, so that it's involved in many addictive behaviors. And so that's how a ketogenic diet can help regulate this system. Do you know whether some studies have investigated the effects of ketogenic diets on the dopamine system?
Yeah, there was a study where they looked at a ketogenic diet in those with alcohol use disorder, and they also they showed that there was a reduction in alcohol consumption, and also showed an increase in mood, and so that was a helpful study. But there isn't enough research yet in this field, and more people are starting to do research in this field, which is very needed and very interesting. And so one of the things that I'm working on is looking at how the ketogenic diet affects mood in bipolar illness as well as schizophrenia. So there's been some reports and case studies about schizophrenia improving, specifically the psychosis symptoms improving with the ketogenic diet. And with bipolar illness, it makes a lot of sense, because theoretically, there's this thing it's called BDNF, and that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It creates more connections. You can kind of think of it as miracle grow for the brain. And a ketogenic diet will stabilize blood sugar, so you avoid those hormonal shifts, but it also increases the expression of this miracle grow. And that's been associated with the lower food intake, and the diets kind of higher in sugar and refined carbohydrates actually have shown to, decrease that expression. And so we think that might be another mechanism as well for binge eating and with food addiction, and as well as mood disorders. So the ketosis what we think is it dampens down reward signaling. So I mentioned that before, but I didn't explain the specifics. And there's excitatory activity in the brain. Your brain is, constantly communicating from, one part of the brain to another. You have electrical signals, and those electrical signals are given by these chemical messengers. And there's always this relationship of how much of this chemical messenger and how much of this, and the levels are changing constantly. And so if there's a rise in one and there's a decrease in the another, that gives the brain a signal to do X, to either fire or not to fire. And so with a ketogenic diet, what happens is it actually decreases the excitatory activity in the brain, which is very helpful in conditions like addictive diseases, alcohol use disorder, or even opiate use disorder, and binge eating and food addiction to that effect as well. So we see that, so there's this neurotransmitter called GABA, and that inhibits response. It dampens down that excitement in the brain. And there's glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter that increases the firing in the brain. And so when we have too much carbohydrates or we have too much refined sugars, we're actually increasing that excitatory activity more, and we're not having enough of that inhibition that we need. In certain conditions like bipolar illness, for example, we have much more of that excitatory activity. And what we do in the, pharmacotherapeutic agents that we use, we use these drugs that actually stabilize the mood and dampen down that excitement. So what a ketogenic diet will do is dampen down that excitement with food. All right. It's really an intervention, not just a diet. It's really changing the signaling in the brain in a way that the medications are doing. So indirectly, it's altering neurotransmission. And so there may be other mechanisms, but certainly this is a big one that we think is responsible for making changes mechanistically.
Yeah, and I want to make a comment on this beautiful concept that you just described, because the ketogenic diet is a therapeutic intervention, and it can be viewed as one of the first examples of an epigenetic intervention based on what you just said. So a diet that is known to be associated with specific gene expression pattern. And Shebani described how there is the upregulation of inhibitory pathways in the brain and downregulation of excitatory pathways. And really, this is, I think, one of I teach a class on diet and gene expression, and some of my students ask me, are there any examples of dietary interventions that have epigenetic effects? This is one. It is strongly associated with these major shifts in brain pathways, and I think this is very exciting. We are also trying in the Diet Fit study to make these associations with what are the pathways that are activated by a low-fat diet and a low-carb diet. And we do see differences. The diet that we tested is not a ketogenic diet. It was a strict low-carb diet only in the first 3 months, and then slowly shifted to I would say like the high carbohydrate diet. But anyway, but we do still, we see differences, and we see that the low carbohydrate diet is activating more immune pathways, and so pathways associated with immunity, and the low fat diet more pathways associated with the cancer biology. Anyway, my point is that the ketogenic diet is one, I think, the first and best established examples of epigenetic interventions. So thank you very much, Shebani. I would like to invite my students to ask you some questions, but before I do that, would you like to make any final remark or things I didn't ask you and you wish I had asked you?
No, Lucia, that was great. I guess the one thing that I could mention that I think would be interesting is that, the prevalence of obesity, we all know, has been increasing, right? And eating disorders, in particular, binge eating also, and addictive like eating have really risen. And it also has, risen in concordance with the increasing dominance of ultra processed foods and refined sugar in our diets and in the modern food environment. And I think that's really is something to think about, because the way, the way we think about diets is, you're temporarily on them and then you're off them. But if you think about it from a lifestyle change perspective, there's something that we're doing right now that is not good, right? The way that our standard American diet is 300 something carbohydrates a day. That's, our bodies were not meant to metabolize so much of the excess carbohydrates. And so it's very interesting that, our research now is focusing on changing dietary uh, patterns just to improve these higher and higher rates of disease. So it's not just mental illness, but there are many other medical conditions that we're seeing: blood pressure, diabetes. 50 years ago, we didn't see so much of this. It was something that we saw in patients who were in their 50s, 40s, 50s. And now we're seeing these illnesses in kids. And mental illness is always something that's been there, but we haven't had so many rates of this. And like I mentioned, it's a heterogeneous condition. So that means there are multiple causes. It's multifactorial: genes, environment, a combination of that. And if we're thinking like autism rates have spiked, I mean, there's so much that we're learning, and we should keep in mind, what we're doing to our brains, because it's not just the liver or the pancreas. It's not just diabetes or fatty liver that we're causing. We're really affecting all of our bodies, and we're affecting our brain. And so I would just, end with that concept is to think big picture about what we are doing to our bodies. Brain and body are connected. So
what a beautiful message to end this informative and inspiring conversation.